Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first Author Happy Hour brought to you by the Kentucky Book Festival, a program of Kentucky Humanities. I'm Sarah Woods, the director of the Kentucky Book Festival, and I'm so glad you've joined us tonight. While the Kentucky Book Festival has gone virtual this year, we're committed to bringing you exciting author events from now until November 14th. To stay tuned to announcements and the schedule and our lineup, please check kentuckyhumanities.org or join us on our social media feeds. You can follow us at KYHumanities. These happy hour sessions will happen every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern from now through the end of October. Tonight, we're joined by two authors to celebrate the release of their most recent book called Which Fork Do I Use with My Bourbon, published recently by the University Press of Kentucky. Grab your beverage of choice and get ready to learn how to host the perfect bourbon tasting. I've got my Old Forester 86 proof, along with some milk chocolate and pecans as it complements the flavor of this bourbon. If you have questions as we move along, type them in the Q&A box and hit send. We will do a Q&A towards the end of the session with our two authors. Peggy Stevens founded the Bourbon Women Association and is the first woman in the world to receive the title of Master Bourbon Taster. Formerly of Brown-Forman, Peggy was their global event producer for iconic brands like Woodford Reserve. In 2019, she was inducted into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. For 15 years, Susan Reigler was a restaurant critic, beverage columnist, and travel writer for the Louisville Courier-Journal, and has been a judge for the James Beard Foundation Restaurant Award since 1997. She is the current president of the Bourbon Women Association. Susan and Peggy, thanks for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good evening, Sarah.
Nice to be here.
You know, Susan, I'm wondering if we should let everybody in on the secret of why we wrote this book.
Well, I think that's a really good place to start. And
Yeah.
it was your brainchild, Peggy, so I think you should take it away here.
Well, essentially, I think I've had this book, Which Fork Do I Use with My Bourbon, in my head for probably 10 years because, you know, as I would travel around and conduct bourbon tastings across the U.S., I would always have people come up to me afterwards and say, well, now, how do I do this in my home? You know, how did you learn how to be a master taster? Or how do I know the right thing to serve to my guests if I want to do a sit-down dinner and serve bourbon? And so the more questions I think that I received, you know, the more I thought, you know, you really don't have to be an expert to have great hospitality. And, you know, it's really about the traditions of Kentucky that we want to share. It's not about, you know, bourbon pretentiousness or, you know, for the elite or anything like that. It was really our very sincere opportunity to share what we know after all the years that we've been doing this. And Susan, of course, is a dear friend of mine. We first met when she was the food critic at the Courier. And from there, you know, she and I do whiskey reviews together with American Whiskey Magazine. She was the president of the Bourbon Women Association, which I founded. And the more we talked and the more we enjoyed each other, I thought, you know, I'm never going to get this book done because I've had it in my head for 10 years. And Susan, would you want to co-author this, you know, to motivate me, and we can share and discuss and, you know, really create a dynamic book with all your knowledge and my knowledge? And so the answer was yes. And so Susan, you take it from that.
Well, what we managed to do was divvy up the chapters. We sort of looked at each of our best areas of expertise and said, well, this is, I think we can do this. And we gave ourselves a very strict deadline. We would each write, and then we would swap chapters and make suggestions to one another and go back and write some more. And we decided we were really going to push it to get it out by Derby for 2020, and, you know, big party season. And
yeah, that was the intention.
The perfect timing, wasn't it? It was just great when you absolutely could not party at Derby this year in May, and not even really much in September. So, however, pardon me, I need a little bourbon, actually.
That's all right. So we
Oh.
made, lemonade out of lemons because we thought, well, gosh, no one's hosting, big events right now. So, we're launching this at one of the biggest events of the year, Kentucky Derby. So we've had a lot of fun with it because we did kind of a play on words about, get ready when the world opens back up. And, COVID, and we could start entertaining again. So the book has done so well. We're so pleased in this environment of today because I think that people are craving to entertain and to understand how to entertain and have a party as soon as they can. I do want to share a little funny story before Susan kind of takes it and talks about the product we're going to taste tonight. But what was so interesting is we thought, what is the title of this book? And I happen to have I'm certified in etiquette and protocol. And so we always say that bourbon really doesn't have an etiquette. It's all about how you enjoy it. Again, not to be pretentious and make people feel that it's unapproachable. And so we thought that title of Which Fork Do I Use with My Bourbon was the best play on words that we could think of to title this book.
And in fact, we came up with it when we were driving to a bourbon event in Nashville. That it's always dangerous when Peggy and I are on the road together because we talk and we do our version of thinking and we come up with some pretty wild and crazy ideas. And our title, we think, worked out pretty well. It catches people's attention. That's certainly true.
So tonight we just wanted to take you through one of our basic tastings. Susan's going to talk about a little bit of the history and heritage of the brand that you've been served, or hopefully you've picked up and you have in your hand. And then I'll go a little bit more in some of the tips that we tell people, ways to better taste a product and to conduct a tasting if you have a crowd, some of the flavor profiles.
Well, we're going to start. We suggested Old Forester for a couple of reasons. One, it's a very traditional bourbon in so many ways. Probably most of you know, since you're mostly Kentuckians, I'm sure, tuning in this evening, that bourbon has to be at least 51% corn in its mash bill, in its grain recipe. Old Forester is very typical in being 72% corn, 18% rye, and 10% malted barley. So the rye gives a little bit of spice and spine. Of course, you need the malted barley for the fermentation. I won't bore you with all the details on that this evening. We don't have time, but I go into it since I'm a recovering biology professor and I really love all of that scientific aspect of the bourbon industry. But Old Forester, again, a very historic brand. It is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. It is the only bourbon still sold today, pre-prohibition brand that was made by its original distillery pre-prohibition, which is pretty amazing. Sort of after prohibition, there were a lot of brands that had been around in the 19th century, but they were sold, or the names were sold, the mash bills. I mean, there was a lot of brand swapping after prohibition, and some a little before and still to this day, but that's one of the things that makes Old Forester special. Another is that its founder, George Garvin Brown, was a pharmaceutical salesman. And of course, that meant, in the 1860s, if you were a pharmaceutical salesman, you were also a whiskey salesman. And he had clients who were physicians, he had clients who were, shopkeepers. And the way that you bought whiskey at the time is you took your own container to the store and it was filled up from the barrel, sitting in the store. Well, if the barrel starts to get a little low and it's going to be another several weeks before a new barrel arrives, that shopkeeper is going to look to keep his customers happy. So he's going to add some water to that barrel, but that dilutes it, right? That lowers the proof. So in order to up the proof, you might splash in a little kerosene, that'll raise the alcohol level a little bit. And it's still sort of pale, so you want to darken it up. Again, just so the customers are seeing something that they expect. So you could add prune juice or tea, or creosote, or my personal favorite, the stuff that's sitting in the spittoon next to the counter, that'll darken it up big time, right? It lends a certain tobacco note to your bourbon. So you could see that there was a reason that Brown was getting a few complaints from his customers that maybe the quality wasn't always consistent in bourbon. And he had a real interesting idea. He said, you know what? Even though it's going to make it more expensive, I am going to sell my bourbon exclusively in sealed glass bottles. And I'm going to put my name on the label. I'm going to sign it. To this day, you can still see Brown's signature on every label of Old Forester to guarantee the quality of the whiskey. And he gambled that people would pay more for it. And, you know, today, a fifth generation of his descendants are still active in the Brown-Forman Corporation. So I think that gamble paid off pretty well. He had another really great stroke of marketing genius. He said, you know, people will trust this bourbon even more from the name. And he asked his friend, Dr. William Forester, prominent Louisville physician, if he could use Forester's name on the bottle. And the doctor said yes. He, of course, got a cut of the profits. And, you know, if a doctor's name is on it, on your whiskey, it has to be really, really good. So Brown was very, very smart in guaranteeing quality. He really did a service to the American whiskey industry by doing that. And there's so much more history I could go into about Old Forester and Brown-Forman, but that's sort of the basics. That's the nuts and bolts and the origin of the company, which is you know, now a worldwide company, and they sell a lot of bourbon. In fact, they also sell a lot of Tennessee whiskey. Jack Daniel's is their brand, the largest selling American whiskey in the world. So it's a big company with a really fascinating history.
You know, Susan and I are so fascinated, of course, with the history and heritage of an over 200-year-old, you know, product. And, you know, even today, 95% of the world's bourbon is made here, right here in Kentucky. So we kind of couldn't help ourselves but to sprinkle some heritage and history throughout the book, you know, right alongside some of our tasting tips, which actually has been one of the most popular chapters, I would say, wouldn't you, Susan? In the book?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we even have an entire chapter not only on specifically on Derby entertaining, but also from the distilleries and how they do their entertaining. Woodford Reserve, another Brown-Forman company, Maker's Mark, Buffalo Trace. You know, a lot of the distilleries are now very, very much into having restaurants and hosting dinners, and entertaining is a huge part of what they do, of welcoming people to their distilleries and welcoming people to Kentucky.
So I want to do a little welcome tasting with you. Hopefully you were able to get your hands on some of that Old Forester and pour yourself a little bit of that in your glass. These are Glencairn glasses, and Susan and I talk about these in the book. These are specially made for sipping whiskey. We love the bulb shape. You know, it kind of traps the aroma. You don't have to have these in order to taste whiskey. You know, these are just helpful to us. But the thing that we love about showing people how to taste are kind of the in-between things, actually. So one of the tips that we like to say is how to judge a whiskey. There's usually 4 different ways we do it. One is to look at the color, the aroma, the flavor, and then what we like to call the finish, you know, almost like the aftertaste of the whiskey. And so do yourself a favor if you've already poured, or pour yourself a glass alongside with us, and just take a look at the color, because what you want, and it's even more helpful if you have something white, like a piece of paper, a white piece of paper to put behind it. And you want kind of a rich amber color, you know, lots of sparkle and bounce. You don't want it cloudy or oily, you know, anything that would leave. See how Susan's holding that up? Right on cue, Susan, as usual. Love it. And so that's what we're looking for. And Old Forester has such a rich amber, and that's why I love the color of it. And then when you nose a bourbon, you know, something to keep in mind because of the proof. Now, tonight, this is about 86 proof. Some of you might have an Old Forester, like a 1910 or something, but we're focused right now on an 86 proof whiskey, which is really considered fairly low, you know, in today's standards. But when you nose a bourbon, we're not like those wine people that stick that nose down and breathe it in, you know, because of the alcohol proof. You know, it'll deaden your senses. So we kind of take it easy in Kentucky and just pull it in to the side, just small, short puffs of air. And you really start to appreciate the aroma because you get a very nice vanilla with Old Forester. I can't help but to get caramel. And so how Susan and I like to tell people the easiest way to identify an aroma is walk through in your head kind of your flavors of spice, sweet, earthy, you know, fruity. Because when you break it down like that, you can really focus on it. So on a sweet note, Susan, I always get the caramel and vanilla. If I were to think fruit, hands down, I think Old Forester is known for banana, almost banana bread.
Definitely banana bread, and a little touch of orange in there, just a little.
Yeah, slight
orange.
citrus.
Yeah, but yeah, banana big time.
Yeah, and then when I think of spice, traditionally, I always get kind of a black pepper note to Old Forester. So use your food memory. You know, everybody likes to eat. We all know what an orange tastes like, and we all know what a banana tastes like, or pepper. And so when you start to think in food memory, it really helps you hone in to what you're nosing. And it helps your guests understand better as well. Now, do yourself another favor and dip your finger. This is one of the tricks of the trade. Dip your finger in that glass and dot a little bit of that bourbon in your hands and rub your hands really vigorously together. And you nose it. And it smells like fresh baked bread. You know, this leans in to me to tell you a little bit about the grains that were used. Because Old Forester has a higher rye content. You have to use at least 51% corn as the predominant grain to be a bourbon. And then after that, it's up to the master distiller to create that secret recipe. But this certainly has a more like a rye bread nose to it. I do get the sweetness of the corn, but it's just something that we like to do just to bring out some of that grain. Now, to taste it. If you're not used to drinking bourbon, this is really going to help you. And if you are used to drinking bourbon, this is going to train you actually to identify the flavors a little bit better so you can decide, hey, I would like a full glass of this now. So to taste it, you're just going to take a small amount. And Susan, why don't you help me alongside just showing how to do it? You just take a little taste of it. And then after you swallow, you're actually going to blow out, just like Susan's going to do. You're actually going to blow out because that blows out some of the alcohol and really gets to the flavors.
And I'm getting a beautiful caramel all around my mouth.
It's almost like caramel marshmallow.
Right. Yeah.
It's really rich. I always think of Woodford too as a little bit nutty, like nutty pecan. So when I put that caramel, that marshmallow, that pecan together, it's almost like a Mounds bar.
Yeah, and Woodford Reserve, of course, is also made by Brown-Forman, and it has exactly the same mash bill, but it's aged differently. There's so many ways of going into the various ways that the distillers put different flavors into their bourbon, or extract them, I should say, from.
That's right.
The distillate.
And so your olfactory senses, honestly, what we know is your olfactory senses really are stronger almost than your taste buds. You know, that's why when you have a cold, you can't taste anything. So to me, I am definitely getting that caramel. I'm getting that banana again, but I'm really getting a nice pecan nuttiness.
And some cinnamon, a little bit of cinnamon spice.
A little bit of spice and hints of chocolate.
Oh,
but
yeah.
It's not dark chocolate. It's more like milk chocolate to me.
True.
I mean, it's just delicious. And as we're talking, do you still taste the whiskey? You absolutely do. And that's the fourth way we judge a bourbon, is the finish. And the finish is how it leaves your mouth. You know, can you still taste it? Does it linger? Is it a long, sweet, dry finish? You know, does it cause you to reach for a glass of water as a chaser? So we always like to break it down in simple terms so that you can do this in your home. We also asked everybody to go out and get, I think, some pecans and some chocolate. And that leads to, I think it's chapter 5, Susan, our food pairing chapter.
Correct.
And food pairing is as simple as what we just did right now. But a lot of people are intimidated by it. So the reason we asked you to buy some pecans and some chocolate is because we're going to demonstrate something that we taught in the book. And it's how to do a food pairing. And we have 3 ways of doing it. We have balance, which is when you take one of the predominant flavors that you tasted in the whiskey and you match it to the simple food that you're about to eat. And then we have something called counterbalance, which you take an absolute opposite, almost like a Cajun pecan and a Riesling wine. That Riesling wine is so sweet, it's going to overlay the spiciness of that Cajun pecan. And then the third way to do a food pairing is called counterbalance, or I'm sorry, explosion. So explosion is when you take the most predominant and you just take it on to new heights so that it causes surround sound in your mouth of flavor. So on the pecan, I'd love for you to take a big bite of that pecan and chew it a little bit so you really have that flavor of pecan, and then take a sip of your Old Forester, and that is going to demonstrate balance. Because it's even, it's easy. Susan, I think this is one of your favorite simple foods to pair.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So while you're doing that, because I want you to experience it, just to tell you a little bit more about the book, you know, what we're doing tonight are very simple foods for tasting. We have an advanced chapter called Advanced Bourbon Tastings and Pairings. And so that's when you're really pairing a full dinner with your different bourbons or hors d'oeuvres or appetizer. In other words, you have layers of food to identify. And that to me was, that was probably my favorite chapter to write. Don't you think, Susan, for me?
Absolutely. Yeah, I got to read it several times because you were so proud of it, Peggy. Yeah.
I loved it. So how did you like the pecan with the Old Forester? I think it was delicious.
Mm.
Now, at the same time, I'm going to do another balance example because I get chocolate notes. And so we asked everyone to buy some milk chocolate. And so take a bite, and really and truly as a dessert, you know, just to enjoy by yourself at night if you want, is the best thing is chocolate and bourbon. I just don't know how it gets any better than that. So take a bite of the milk chocolate. Again, chew it so you really have that tongue coated, then take a sip of your whiskey. How was it, Susan?
You know, I don't even know why I would ever drink bourbon without some chocolate nearby.
No, it's so true. So we have shared so many of our favorite recipes in this book. It is not a cookbook by any stretch of the imagination. These are just heirloom recipes from our families. They might be recipes that we know that go over well with a crowd or a party, and everything can be paired with your favorite bourbon.
And a lot of good cocktail recipes too. If people are beginners with bourbon, sometimes the easiest way to start to appreciate it is in a really good cocktail. Sort of ease yourself into it that way.
Now, I did see a couple questions come in. So Sarah, let us know if you'd like us to entertain those questions, because one in particular that I saw was, how do you drink your bourbon? What's the right way? Is it with water? Is it with ice? And I have to tell you, it's any way you please, because you can mix it if you want. We might be purists. We drink it, you know, straight a lot of times, neat a lot of times, but there's no wrong answer. All that adding water is going to do is open some fruit notes for you and break down the alcohol molecules a little bit. Adding a cube of ice, of course, I tend to like a cooler drink. So I will add an ice cube, big block of ice, one that melts very slowly. So that's one of the questions that I saw.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it actually really helps to especially open up a higher proof bourbon to put a little water in it or to use that ice cube, because you can almost, if you taste a very high proof bourbon, it's almost like, oh, it just seems like it's kind of locked up, but you add that little splash of water and suddenly you get more and more flavor layers emerging, and that's just a really great way to do it.
It is.
I do have a few other questions that have come in.
Sure.
First of all, a few comments that people have been fascinated by the trivia of adding kerosene to the bourbon. I thought that was pretty.
Did that get their attention?
Gosh, yes, yeah, imagine that.
Happily, no one does that anymore. Well, you know,
that we know of, right?
The distillers don't. No.
So one question is, how do you pair the right foods with the notes of the bourbon? So you mentioned tasting banana. Would you serve banana bread, for instance, with something like that?
It would be delicious with banana bread.
Mm-hmm.
That's dead on. And, you know, once you identify the predominant flavors, you know, I always write them down and say, what do I have to work with? And if it's brown sugar, and, you know, aside from Old Forester, if it's brown sugar, then guess what? I might do a brown sugar pound cake with caramel frosting.
Yeah.
How about that for a Kentucky dish?
Start taking notes here.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where the balance comes in, and it makes it easier. And that even translates to your cocktails, because if you really think about it, cocktail mixers are food flavors. I mean, they are absolute flavors. So I will taste my bourbon. I will taste different mixers, because there are so many different types of like whiskey sour mixes. Mm-hmm. And I know it's going to have kind of that citrusy, lemony type note to it. And if I think it will be too heavy for the whiskey that I'm pouring, then I won't use it. I'll use something lighter. So it's about, and this is another piece of the book, we talk a lot about intensity, the intensity of a flavor, because that intensity can also lead you to make sure that you don't overpower a food with your whiskey. And I'll give you an example. Let's take orange roughy. You know, orange roughy is a super light fish, right? Very flaky, etc. I would never put a barrel strength bourbon with orange roughy. It's too dainty, and that will overpower it. But bring me a slab of salmon and let me make a marinade with bourbon and brown sugar and maybe some chili peppers, and absolutely, it's going to stand up to it. It'll be okay. So we talk a lot about the intensity levels of food and of whiskey.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's awesome. Beth Barnes, who's joined us tonight, says that she's had your books for several weeks now. And
good.
Yeah, she said she's loved dipping into it. She really appreciates the heritage elements that you've included. And her question is, because she says, because I love wheated bourbons, do you have any particular pairing recommendations for wheated bourbons?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know. Susan, do you mind if I take that? Or
No, go for it.
Okay. One wheated bourbon, of course, that most people know is Maker's Mark. One of my very favorite appetizers that I use with Maker's Mark, because Maker's Mark has kind of a honey note. It has citrus notes. I get clear orange citrus notes in Maker's Mark. And it is a wheated whiskey. So that means it is a lighter intensity. So I will and also it's framed with kind of like breadcrumb, toasty flavors, you know, from the barrel. So I will take a crostini, just a small crostini. I will use goat cheese because it's light and airy. I don't want anything too heavy. I would never use blue cheese with Maker's Mark. So I would take the crostini, the goat cheese. I would put a couple mandarin oranges to bring out the accents of those orange citrus notes. And then I would drizzle it with honey. And it'll be one of the best simple appetizers you can make with a wheated bourbon. Because most wheated bourbons have that kind of honey note and vanilla note.
Yeah, if you keep in mind the difference between something like a wheat thin cracker and a rye crisp, and you really will get the sense of the difference that those two grains bring to bourbon. You're still going to get the sweetness of the corn, because you go back and think about cornbread versus rye bread or wheat bread. You know, it's very sweet. There's a much higher sugar content in corn. So again, as Peggy said, use your food memory, and you simply apply it to the whiskey, you know, because that's what it's doing.
Well, here's a fun question I thought we might encounter tonight. What is the difference between bourbon and whiskey? How many times have you heard that question?
A few times. Bourbon is a whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. In other words, in the genius of our United States, we've come up with categories. Internationally, we've come up with categories. So you think of Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, you know, bourbon whiskey. There's corn whiskey. I mean, the list goes on. So everybody has their own kind of definition in how to make it. So Susan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, bourbon is, as Peggy said, a style of whiskey. It is a type of whiskey. I mean, think about different flavors of ice cream. You know, chocolate, strawberry, vanilla are all ice cream, but they're very different because they are flavored in different ways. And so the flavoring grains in different whiskeys determine the style. So Scotch is all barley. You know, Irish whiskey is mostly barley. Sometimes there's a little corn in there. Rye whiskey has to be at least 51% rye, as bourbon has to be at least 51% bourbon. So these are just simply all whiskey styles, and bourbon is one of the great whiskey styles of the world.
Wow. I almost want to ask you, as a former English major, why there's sometimes an E in whiskey and sometimes
Yeah, and interestingly, Old Forester leaves out the E. Mostly the E is added in America and Ireland, and there is no E between the S and the Y. And is that right? Yes, between the K and the Y. I never could do spelling bees in school. Between the K and the Y. In Scotland, traditionally, or a very few, or Japanese whiskey or Indian whiskey. It's just one of those things. It's like the English spell color differently than we spell color or honor.
right.
So it's just one of those little quirks. Yeah, they throw in a U. So that's what it is. But there are a very few American bourbons that omit the E. Old Forester is one of them, and interestingly, Maker's Mark is one of them.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So more food questions. I know we're all probably starving by now.
I have chocolate. I'm good. So.
Yeah. How do you choose the best bourbon for bourbon balls? It seems that bourbon balls have a different flavor depending on the brand that people use.
You are so correct. And just a funny story, when long time ago, when Woodford Reserve was being built, I was the first visitor center director. And we decided that we wanted to serve a bourbon candy with peach tea, you know, after the visitors came off of the tour. And I was on a hunt, literally a hunt throughout Kentucky to find the best bourbon candy known to man. And we ended up at Ruth Hunt. And specifically, I chose that because of Woodford Reserve's flavor profile. And, you know, I knew I wanted a bit of a dark chocolate. I wanted a nougat in the middle that had some substance to it. I wanted to taste the bourbon, but I didn't want it to overpower. I wanted it to have more harmony to it. So believe me, I have become a bourbon ball snob over the years. And I'm not saying that I chose the best one. I've had so many good ones from different distilleries, but those are the things you think about back to intensity. You know, there are some bourbon candies that would not taste good with dark chocolate. There are some bourbon candies that almost punch you in the face with the whiskey before you enjoy the sweet. So again, it's back to style of the candy maker.
Mm-hmm. Right. We're coming up into fall, and it's kind of a beautiful time to travel across Kentucky when the leaves start to change. I wonder, you have probably both done stops on the Bourbon Trail, right, in Kentucky, probably most of them. What is your favorite or one of your favorite stops on the Bourbon Trail?
I just want to mention that my third edition of the travel guide to Bourbon Country is being released in 2 weeks. Just wanted to throw that in there since this is the book festival.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've been to all of them many times. Yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah.
Gosh, what would be your favorite? They're asking our favorite.
Oh, okay. That's
I got to
a
tell you, I
perilous
don't
question.
think
They're so different.
they're
They
so
all have something to offer, from the deeply historical places to the brand new modern ones. I think the answer is simply you start with one or two and you make a point of going to all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because
and I have to tell you, I think, my answer is not a good one for just a consumer that wants to go through it. Because, part of my company is actually building and designing, conceptualizing visitor center experiences. We're experiential marketing people. So my answer, though, after visiting so many of these distilleries, is it's not like I remember the distillery itself as much as the experience that I had there. So with Woodford, it will always be special to me because that's where I cut my teeth. That's where I became a master taster. With Maker's Mark, it's special to me because I have a beautiful relationship, with the Samuel family. And Susan and I put on a huge event for bourbon women, a huge dinner there at Maker's Mark. I will always remember that night. So mine are more snapshots of experiences. So I'm encouraging you, if you haven't visited or want to visit more, not to so much compare each visitor center or experience to say one was better than the other. It's what do you remember from that trip?
Right.
What do you remember from that tour?
they really are all wonderful.
They are.
They really are. And the best part is that you have the heritage of so many of them. You have, of course, the beams going back to the 18th century. Buffalo Trace, they have buildings there that date from the late 1700s. The heritage from Woodford, going to Stitzel-Weller in Louisville, which was Pappy Van Winkle's distillery. I mean, they just all have their own stories.
They do.
And the new ones are coming up with their own stories. And very exciting, for instance, Bullet has committed to being a 100% sustainable, very modern distillery. So it's the variety, I think, is much, it's just really worth seeking out. It's really fun, and go visit them. Now, some of them are still closed right now because of COVID, but others have limited reservation only visitation, and everybody wears masks and distances, but many of them are open, and certainly, dip your toe in and you can take your mask off when you taste. That's a good one.
Yeah. Take it down when you try to smell it, right? Too, probably that would help.
Right.
Another good question from one of our board members, Brian Clardy. What are the best bourbon pairings for this holiday season?
Oh, that's a great one.
Which holiday season? Halloween? Want to make a pumpkin old fashioned? That's a good one.
Maybe. You probably
See, I jumped to Christmas because
Oh,
well,
fine.
the reason why I do
fame,
is
so, yeah.
I have what I call my big fat Italian Christmas party at my house. I don't know how it's going to go this year, considering everything. But we have like 70 people. I have a huge family that come, and every year, even when I try to make different things, my family wants the same. And so one of our favorites, and goes unbelievable with bourbon, is we do a pancetta crisp. I literally bake the pancetta, and I put a dollop of goat cheese on it and sprinkle it with some thyme and some balsamic vinegar. And it is so savory. I do a stuffed mushroom, and we take country ham and herb cheese, like a Boursin cheese, and I put it in a blender, and it's all country ham and some cheese, and stuff these big portobello mushrooms and bake them. And then I sprinkle olive oil or drizzle olive oil all over it. Those are phenomenal because of the savory, earthy, mushroomy country ham note. Those are just a couple of appetizers. I can go on. How long you have? I have a buffet I usually serve.
It sounds amazing. We've got plenty of time.
Yeah.
We do have quite a few more questions.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Those
Um,
are just a couple of my favorite appetizers for the
Yeah.
holidays. And you don't have to do them just Christmas. Those could be for Thanksgiving, whatever.
Are some of those included in the book? Some of those?
They are actually. I know my beef tenderloin that I make during the holidays is my mother-in-law's recipe, and that has a bourbon ginger marinade with
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, that all sounds so good.
And a very, very simple one is popcorn and bacon drippings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you do with all those bacon drippings? Well, I have
That's
a
right.
lot. I mean, if you're a vegetarian, you don't. But if you have bacon drippings, boy, don't be shy. Use plenty of bacon. Have a good, quarter to half an inch at the bottom of your pan, and you'll have wonderful, savory, bacony popcorn. Great with bourbon.
Huh.
It's so simple.
It's a great idea. We have another question from Nancy. She says her husband sounds like he'd love the book. She said she couldn't put it down. It is fantastic. She's planning her first blind tasting with a few of her friends.
Great.
She's thinking of either doing all over 100 proof. Would you suggest a range for over 100? She said maybe 107 could be too different from 120.
Yeah, I definitely, I think immediately for 107, I think of bakers. That's
Bakers
bakers,
or,
not makers.
Yeah, or Weller Antique.
Or Weller Antique.
Yeah.
I love the idea
I'm a little
of
scared. I
doing,
know all these proofs, by the way.
yeah, I love the idea of doing different proofs. What I will recommend is that you do them in that order, from lowest proof to highest proof, even if they're over 100 proof, because your taste buds are going to graduate.
Mhm.
So that's one recommendation, but I think that's great.
And use water. Do not be afraid of using water. You will get so much more out of the bourbons when you add just a splash. It doesn't have to be a lot, but
Right.
a little splash is really good.
And should you drink a little bit of water between each
Absolutely.
tasting?
I drink more water when I'm doing bourbon tastings than at any other time, actually.
Yeah, and one of the things we talk about as well, because you can have olfactory, kind of aroma fatigue especially with the higher proofs. So to help your guests, we suggest either having coffee beans or just the back of your arm or hand, as long as it doesn't have a lot of lotion, and it neutralizes you back to normal, after nosing.
Yeah. Actually, even, your sleeve is really good.
Right.
I'm learning all kinds of new things. What about the bourbons that are coming out of New York State? Do you have any recommendations or reviews?
There's some good ones. Hudson Baby bourbon.
That's the first one that came to mind for me.
Right. Kings County. That's a good one. There are bourbons now made in all 50 states. They are different, and that's the fun of them. Kentucky bourbon tastes like Kentucky bourbon. And I've actually done several blind tastings where I will have maybe 5 bourbons and 2 are from Kentucky and 3 are from elsewhere. And I ask people to identify the Kentucky bourbons, and almost all the time people get it right. They'll say, oh, those are the Kentucky bourbons. Not sure where the other 3 are from. They're good, but they're not Kentucky bourbons, just because it's like, when you taste a Bordeaux, it comes from Bordeaux, France. Even though a really fine Napa Valley Cabernet is a fine wine, but it's not a Bordeaux.
Mhm.
And Susan and I, because we do whiskey reviews, we do appreciate the regionality and personality,
Absolutely.
of all the different places across the U.S. making whiskey, because it truly is different. It's just, what can I say? We put our stake in the ground as the pedigree for bourbon.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the other distilleries are very conscious of this, and they say, we're not trying to copy Kentucky
No.
because Kentucky
No.
does it so well. We want to carve out our own identity
Right.
as bourbon makers. And
And
there's some
I deal with I deal with so many craft distillers across the US. And what's so lovely is when they tell me their story, they might be from Texas, they might be from Ohio, and they tell me their story about how they're learning about whiskey and going to like Moonshine University here in Louisville. But they say how welcoming Kentucky is when they come and try to learn from us and meet different distillers or meet people that are in production. And I think that's great. I mean, I think it's good for our industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I get a lot of that in the author community too, people that visit Kentucky for the first time. So here's another good question from Beth. She says, I was very surprised on a visit to Scotland to learn that Scottish distillers, almost without exception, age in Kentucky bourbon barrels. Do you think it has to do with the charring and the intensity of Kentucky bourbons?
It has to do with you can only use a bourbon barrel once for bourbon. So the distilleries are going to sell those barrels and make some more money. But also they're well-made barrels, and they do get a little of that extra Kentucky flavor out of their barrels.
They do. And if you think about Scotland and their whiskey, you know, that's why you see 10-year-old, 15-year-old, 20-year-old, 25-year-old scotches, because it takes them longer to, you know, some of them even add caramel because it takes them longer to get that color, longer to get the flavors because they're using used barrels. You know, think of a new car. You know, when you drive a new car, you get that new car smell and the leather, and you get the best engine. That's what Kentucky has. You know, we have to have a new charred white oak barrel as part of our definition in order for it to be a bourbon. So up to 85% of all the compounds of that barrel and the barrel flavors are taken from that first whiskey. So think about that. So then we sell our barrels on, and what do they get? Now, there are great scotches. They're made differently. They're appreciated. I'm a big fan of Ardbeg and, you know, the big bold scotches. I'll be a fan of that. But we have a lot of respect for barrel and cooperage here in Kentucky.
Yeah, and again, the aging process in Kentucky, you know what our summers are like. Right. And the top of a bourbon warehouse can get 120 degrees Fahrenheit and hotter. In Scotland, if it gets to be 50 degrees in the middle of their summer, that's hot, okay? So you're not getting the evaporation. You're not getting as much expansion of the wood for the whiskey to go into the wood and come out of the wood. So that's why scotches can age so much longer and not taste woody, whereas we leave our bourbon in the barrels for too long. You know, they just taste like toothpicks or Louisville Sluggers, or, you know, it's not a happy thing. But and so many other products are aged in bourbon barrels, and includes rums, tequilas, Tabasco sauce. A lot of people don't know that. So
beer,
yeah, a lot of craft beers now are bourbon finished. So there's some wines that are being finished in bourbon barrels, red wines. So our bourbon barrels have very long lives, even after they've left Kentucky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my next question, was talking about Kentucky bourbon barrel ale, for instance, and other things that are, you know, go through the barrel. Another question from Pete, and this is specific. He says, what information do you have on Blanton's tasting? What flavors should he look for when drinking Blanton's?
Oh, Blanton's is, that's a really lovely, complex bourbon.
I was going to say there's so many.
There are just so many. I think it comes down a little more on the vanilla than caramel side. What would you say, Peggy?
And I really get a big, bold, grainy corn sweet to it.
Yeah, almost like.
I always get the grain side.
Yeah, like kind of like roasted corn.
Yeah.
In a good way. You know, you can also say, you know, if it's kind of like if a wine tastes like grapes, it's not a good wine. Right. If a bourbon tastes too much like corn, that's not good. I mean, a young bourbon will just sort of taste like, you know, corn on the cob, not really a great idea. But if you get that sort of buttered roasted corn, that's really nice in bourbon. And I think Blanton's has that with some vanilla definitely the baking spices, maybe a little bit of that milk chocolate note. Gee, I might just have to go downstairs and get some Blanton's after this and just double check all that. But yeah, and I think, and some good, the fruit is more berry fruit than the citrus notes, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, more the darker stone fruits.
yeah, exactly. Sort of orchard, generic orchard fruit there. But the other thing is it just depends on your palate. I could taste something that you think, wow, that's really crazy. And, if you say, wow, I am really tasting, old socks in here. I'm not going to tell you you're not tasting old socks, right? I mean, taste is very, very personal, and we're all very different. So,
and as long as Susan and I have been doing this, and again, we mentioned we do whiskey reviews with American Whiskey Magazine, and they're totally blind tastings. We have no idea except the category, where it comes from, and the proof of what we're drinking. And then we do our reviews separately. And, after the magazine comes out, we're like, oh, that was Old Forester. Oh, that was, we'll look at our scores because we might really, usually we're pretty close, but sometimes she tastes something completely different than what I taste.
Yeah. We're often very close, but and it's funny because the ones that are really great, we both agree are really great.
Hands down.
Yeah.
We always get the really, really great whiskeys right.
We also go, oh, wow, that was, not really one I'm going to go out there and buy. But the in between is fascinating because that's where we have most of the variation, I think.
Right.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it's going to be our last question for the evening. I want to thank you both for being here and doing this with us. I feel like everyone learned a lot. Thank you, Peggy and Susan. Thank you, everyone else who's watching online. Remember, you can pick up Peggy and Susan's books, including their most recent, Which Fork Do I Use With My Bourbon, and Susan's upcoming at Joseph Beth Booksellers. You can order online at josephbeth.com, and they're also allowing visitors into their storefront here in Lexington and Cincinnati. Remember, you can register in advance for these webinars at kyhumanities.org. And be sure to follow us at kyhumanities on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook for announcements and updates on the Kentucky Book Festival. We're working really hard behind the scenes to get everything together for you. If you've participated through Zoom, after this webinar closes, you'll see a prompt for a survey. It's short, it's only 5 questions, and we would really appreciate your feedback about this event. Stay up to date by signing up for our newsletter on kyhumanities.org. We promise we won't fill up your inbox. It's just every so often. And join us next week for another author happy hour about writing strong female leads in fiction with authors Kimmery Martin, Meg Cabot, Colleen Oakley, and Sheila Williams. And that's next week at 7 p.m. See you Thursday.